Okay, ready to go. All right, I want to back up a little bit in your notes, and I want to go to the part in your notes where it said that prior to the trial of Andrew Johnson, who was impeached by the House for high crimes and misdemeanors, before he went to the trial, which would be conducted by the Senate, one member of the Senate, Jim Lane from Kansas, committed suicide, and he was replaced by Edmund G. Ross. And we mentioned to you that the trial ensued, and it ended on the Senate's decision on whether or not President Johnson would be removed from office. And it took a 2/3 majority vote to remove the president. So when all the votes were cast, the Senate needed only one more vote to achieve the 2/3 majority. And ironically, there was only one senator left to cast his vote, thus deciding the future of President Johnson. And that senator that would cast that final vote was Senator Edmund G. Ross of Kansas, who replaced Jim Lane. Now, Republicans controlled Congress, and those Republicans, along, especially with the radical Republicans, were certain that Ross would cast the remaining vote to get rid of President Johnson once and for all. And instead, Ross stood on the floor of the Senate under tremendous pressure and cast his deciding vote of not guilty. The radical Republicans were in total shock. As a result, President Johnson remained in office until the end of his term, his political career saved. On the other side of the vote, Edmund Ross's political career was finished. Now, this is one thing I want to add because I did a little research. After serving out his term in the Senate, after that vote, he moved back to Kansas and basically lived out the remainder of his life in obscurity. Became really nobody, and he died in 1907. So he did finish his term, as I mentioned. He went back to Kansas, and he actually moved to a real, what type of word am I looking for? He moved to a non-populated area of Kansas because he wanted to be out away from people, and basically died in obscurity in 1907. So his political career was over. He lived kind of a lonely man the rest of his life and died in 1907. And again, as I mentioned, the book Profiles in Courage came out by Senator John F. Kennedy in 1956. It was a Pulitzer Prize winning book, and he wrote on 8 courageous Americans, and Edmund G. Ross just happened to be one of the men he wrote about, and his chapter was entitled, I Looked Down into My Open Grave. Okay? Does it cool down enough to shut the window?
No.
Yes.
Yeah, let's shut the window, please.
That's
All right. Okay, we summed up the presidency of Andrew Johnson. I want to make sure you have these. We told you basically that according to historians that President Johnson was a misfit for the presidency. And I gave you 5 examples of why he was a misfit for the presidency. Number 1, he was a Southerner who did not understand the North. Number 2, he was a Tennessean who had earned the distrust of the South. Number 3, he was a Democrat who was never accepted by the Republicans. Number 4, he was a president who had never been elected. And number 5 maybe summed up the whole thing the best. He was the wrong man in the wrong place at the wrong time. Now, this is where I'm going to change my philosophy a little bit. We told you that the Reconstruction program laid down by President Lincoln and ratified by President Johnson proceeded despite all this action. And whose task is it going to be to complete Reconstruction? It will belong to Ulysses S. Grant, who's going to be elected president in the upcoming election of 1868. So that will take us to that subtopic then, which is the election of 1868. Now, are there some of you that didn't get those? Okay, now I'm trying to think what I did with those, to be honest with you.
You can go for it. Do you have this? Do you have this right here?
We need to put those somewhere. Well, we'll move on, and I'll just tell you, and we'll make you a copy for tomorrow.
What?
Yep, don't have them. So anyway, we're moving on in our next subtopic then, which isn't on yours, and I'll make sure I write these things down then. The next subtopic is the election of 1868. The election of 1868. Okay? So, we haven't had a presidential election we've talked about in a while because we went through a lot of detail on the Civil War. And again, what are the 2 political parties going on right now? The Republicans and the Democrats. So in the election of 1868, the Republicans, remember, who were still struggling over Reconstruction, they were looking for a candidate in their mind that would bring honor back to the presidency. Okay? So they turned to a natural hero, General Ulysses S. Grant, who obviously was the hero of the Civil War for the North, etc. So Ulysses S. Grant would be the Republican nominee for president in 1868. A fellow by the name of Schuyler Colfax will run as vice president under Grant. So the Republicans nominate General Ulysses S. Grant for the presidency and Schuyler Colfax as Grant's vice presidential running mate. And Schuyler Colfax at the time was serving as Speaker of the House. Speaker of the House of Representatives. Ulysses is kind of tough. It's U-L-Y-S-S-E-S. Yes?
At this time, was it like a public vote, or is it still the state's overall thingy?
I'm not sure what you mean by that.
Like, nowadays, it's not all the citizens that voted.
Yes, it's like it is now, all popular vote, all electoral vote. Remember the electoral vote counts. Okay, so for the Republicans, General Ulysses S. Grant, President Schuyler Colfax as Vice President, and remember that Schuyler Colfax was the Speaker of the House. And when you talk about presidential succession, if the President dies, the Vice President takes over. If the Vice President would die, then the Speaker of the House is next in line. So this is a pretty important fellow here, okay? Yeah?
Why doesn't the Secretary of State go?
That's just the Constitution. That's what they put together. Good question. Now, the Democrats went with a fellow by the name of Horatio Seymour. Now, with a name like this, you wonder how you could win. Horatio Seymour. And these are IDs, that's why I'm putting them on the board. So, the Democratic Party countered with their presidential candidate, Horatio Seymour. And he was a former governor of New York and very wealthy. Okay? So, the Democrats nominate as their presidential candidate Horatio Seymour. He was a former governor of New York and very wealthy. Yes?
Was he Hispanic?
I don't think so, no. So Seymour's choice to be vice president with him was Francis P. Blair Jr. So the vice presidential nominee for the Democratic Party would be Francis P. Blair Jr. And he was a former congressman. In other words, he was in the House of Representatives. So let's sum up this election. For the Republicans, General Ulysses S. Grant for president, Schuyler Colfax, Speaker of the House for vice president. For the Democrats, Horatio Seymour for president, former governor of New York, very wealthy man. His running mate would be Francis P. Blair Jr., who is a former member of Congress, or a member of the House of Representatives. Well, in the popular vote, this was extremely close. Okay, I'll just give you the example. They figured about 6 million votes were cast. 6 million. Of those 6 million, Grant won by 309,000. Or if you look at a percentage of that, it's just about 5%. So Grant only won by 5% of the popular vote. That's a very close election, okay? However, what matters in a presidential election?
Electoral.
Electoral votes. Grant received 214. Seymour, 80. As a result, General Ulysses S. Grant becomes the nation's 18th President of the United States. Okay? Over 6 million popular votes cast, Grant won by 309,000, or about 5% of the popular vote, which is a small margin. However, he won in the Electoral College 214 to 80 to become the nation's 18th president. Okay, there's the numbers there if you need it. Okay, what we're going to do next is we're going to give you a profile on President Grant. Tell you a little bit about him from birth to death. The thing I will tell you up front before we start is his administration was full of scandal. Really had trouble. He had no political experience when he took the oath of office. Here's a guy that's going to be the most powerful man in the world, President of the United States, absolutely no political experience. Zero. Okay? But we'll tell you a little bit about him, yep?
Why would they do that if they have to do political?
Because they were looking for, who the Republicans looking for?
Honor of
Someone to
presidents.
honor the presidency, somebody that would bring honor back to the presidency. They didn't really care if he had any political experience.
No, no.
And they were happy with his election until the scandal started.
Yep. I mean, why would Grant accept to do it if he didn't have any political?
That's a very good question. Why he accepted for the same reason that Dwight D. Eisenhower accepted the nomination of his party in 1952. Why?
Fame? Money.
It was his duty as a military person. If the country calls, you serve. And both those guys had the same in common. Okay, here we go. Ulysses S. Grant was actually the oldest of 6 children. He had 2 brothers and 3 sisters. So Ulysses S. Grant was the oldest of 6 children. He had 2 brothers and 3 sisters, all younger than him. So he was the oldest of 6 children, having 2 brothers and 3 sisters. We're going to talk about one of his brothers when we get into the Native American a little bit later. Okay? In 1823, the Grant family moved to Georgetown, Ohio, where his father owned a tannery and some farmland. So in 1823, the entire Grant family moved to Georgetown, Ohio, where Grant's father owned a tannery and some farmland.
I bet George found that town.
What's that?
I bet George found that town.
I don't know about that. 1823, the Grant family moved to Georgetown, Ohio, where his father owned a tannery and some farmland. Now, as a young boy, Ulysses became an excellent horseman, and his dad often sent him on business trips to go get things for him and go collect either paperwork or payment or deliver goods or whatever. So as a boy, Ulysses S. Grant was an excellent horseman, and he was often sent on business trips for his father. Okay? Well, Ulysses attended his schooling in Georgetown, elementary and high school. And in 1839, Grant's father learned that one of his neighbor's sons had been dismissed from the United States Military Academy at West Point. Okay, I'll repeat that again. In 1839, Grant's father found out that their neighbor's son had been dismissed from the United States Military Academy at West Point. Okay? So Ulysses' dad hears through the grapevine, so to speak, that their neighbor's boy had been dismissed from the United States Military Academy at West Point. That intrigued Grant's father, and so he asked his local congressman if he would appoint his son Ulysses to take the place of that boy that got released. Okay? So Grant's father's intrigued by that. He gets to his local congressman, and he asks his local congressman if he would appoint Ulysses as the replacement for the young man that was dismissed, because he wanted to see his son go to West Point. Now, do you know anything about West Point? It's a military academy. What's it take now to get into West Point? It's the Army Academy. Then you have the Naval Academy. Then you have the Air Force Academy. What these are is they're military training, like colleges, in which you go to that college, the academy, and you learn the military profession, and you can participate in activities, sports, etc. there if they have the teams. And then when you graduate, you owe them so many years of service before you get out to go do your thing. One of the more famous military academy athletes, if you're interested, was Roger Staubach, who won the Heisman Trophy when he played for Navy and then couldn't go to the NFL because he owed the country 6 years of service. And so after he came back from the Army, he started as a rookie in the NFL, like 30 years old. So if you go to the military academy, it's like going to college, but you have to be, I mean, this is a special deal to get selected. You have to have, nowadays, you have to have letters from congressmen and senators and a huge backing, really good grades, real good work ethic to get in. And that's why maybe sometimes the military academies aren't real good in sports, because they aren't, their athletes are good students and maybe not the best athletes, if you know what I mean. Well, anyway, it takes a little bit to get in, so that's why his father asked a local congressman if he would appoint him. Well, the congressman agreed to do so, and so Ulysses Grant headed for West Point after high school to get his degree and commit to military service. So Ulysses S Grant was admitted to West Point after a neighbor's son had been dismissed, and his father talked the local congressman into allowing him to go there. So Grant is going to West Point for his studies and learning how to be a military person.
So his dad signed him up for the Army.
Kind of, but I mean the better part of the Army. I mean, he sent him to West Point to get an education as well. Well, at West Point, Grant was considered an average student. So he was about in the middle of his class, but he ranked high in mathematics and in horsemanship, which are two things that they studied at West Point. So he was considered an average student, ranked about in the middle of his class, but he ranked very high, he scored very high in both mathematics and horsemanship. Mathematics and horsemanship he scored high in. Well, as you do when you graduate from college, Grant graduated from West Point in 1843. And what do you get when you get out of West Point, depending on how well you do? A
Uniform.
with a
Badge.
rank,
Okay.
okay? And when he got out, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant, okay? And you can get ranked depending on how well you do at West Point. So he graduates from West Point in 1843 and is commissioned as a second lieutenant, which isn't bad. So the idea behind going to the Army and going to West Point is when you go in the Army, you start where? At the bottom. If you go to West Point, you come out as an officer. And your rank depends on how well you do there. He came out as a second lieutenant. Well, he was assigned to the 4th Infantry Regiment, which was located in St. Louis, Missouri. So after you get your commission, they assign you somewhere. And he was assigned to the 4th Infantry Regiment out of St. Louis, Missouri. 4th Infantry Regiment, stationed near St. Louis, Missouri. Well, guess what he did in St. Louis while he was on duty there?
Found a girlfriend.
Very good. He found a girlfriend, Julia Dent. Julia Dent. And we'll put that's on your ID sheet, so I'll write it down. He found Julia, a young lady by the name of Julia Dent in St. Louis. Actually, he was a sister of one of his former classmates at West Point. Okay? So she was the sister of one of his classmates at West Point. Well, they fell in love, and in 1848 they were married. Fell in love, and in 1848 Ulysses S. Grant and Julia Dent were married. 1848. Now, is somebody that's commissioned to St. Louis, Missouri going to stay there his whole commission?
No.
No, they're going to move around a little bit. So where in the world was Grant transferred? Fort Vancouver. Where's that located? Anybody want to guess?
Canada.
No, not Canada.
United States.
And what was that called at that time, that area? Vancouver. Fort Vancouver. What was this area called right here?
The East Channel.
The Oregon Territory.
Oregon Territory. Very good. So he was transferred to Fort Vancouver.
No?
Just give it up, man. You got a couple rights. Stick with it. Right
I'm the
there.
student of the week.
Well, you're working
I
on
gotta
it.
keep going.
So he was transferred to Fort Vancouver in the Oregon Territory. Now his wife and infant son couldn't come with him. Yeah.
That's kind of a ways off from the Union, isn't it? Like, what's over there?
Well, we had to protect the territory. Remember, it was ours. Fur traders going in there, start that kind of thing. Things start happening. You have to have presence. Now, Why, AD,
Oh, man.
was he transferred to Fort Vancouver in the Oregon Territory, but his wife and infant couldn't go? Why would that be?
Because they didn't have enough room.
Close,
They
didn't
had to
have
carry
enough
soldiers. Food,
money. Okay, very good. They were left behind because Army pay could not support his family to be there. So he had to leave his family in St. Louis. His wife and his new infant son were left back in St. Louis because the pay he received from the Army couldn't support a family out in the Oregon Territory, couldn't afford for him to go. Because of this, he became what?
Sad.
Very good. Lonely and depressed. Very good. Because of this, he became lonely and depressed. And so how did he handle his depression? Drank. Very good. He was a heavy drinker. Okay? So he cannot have his wife and infant son with him out at Fort Vancouver in the Oregon Territory. As a result, he gets lonely, becomes depressed, and he handles his depression by drinking heavily. Okay? Well, how would he get more money in the Army? What? Being promoted. Very good, Andrew. And he was promoted to the rank of captain in 1853, but even that higher rank didn't give him enough money to take his family with him to his assignment.
1843?
1853, yep.
So how much do you think he was getting paid, like
Oh, I don't know.
25 cents?
He's probably making,
$1?
maybe, I bet he's making $10 a month, something like that.
$10 a month?
Probably. Yeah, I'll look it up though and see.
I'm just kidding.
Oh, so he was promoted to the rank of captain in 1853, but even at that higher rank and more salary, he still couldn't afford to take his family. So he got tired of that, so what did he do in 1854? He resigned. Very good. He resigned and returned to St. Louis with his wife and child. So because he was tired of that lifestyle, missing his family, even though he was promoted in 1853, he resigned in 1854 and moved back to St. Louis with his family.
So like, if he has to go to school, then he has to owe a certain amount of years, so did he already?
He already had his years in, yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
so
he
then
could resign.
after that,
That's a
he
good
can
question.
be done whenever.
After he had his commitment, and he could resign, yeah.
Okay.
Now, what did he do in St. Louis? His father-in-law actually gave him a small farm that he had, and he worked the farm. He liked working the farm, but it was tough times, and so he didn't do very well. Actually, in St. Louis, he worked on that small farm that was given to him by his father-in-law, and even though he liked farming, he was a failure in the farming business. He couldn't make it in the farming business. So, what did he do at the farm when he couldn't make any money? Sold it. Sold it in 1859, and he went to work in a relative's real estate office. So in 1859, he sells the farm. He likes farming, but he just can't get her done and make any money. So he sells the farm in 1859, and he decides to go to work in a relative's real estate office.
So he's gonna have a pretty decent sized resume by the end of this, huh?
Not necessarily good, but yes. Okay, he got fired from his relative's real estate office because he would not go collect the rents. Okay, in other words, this guy had a real estate business. He obviously had some property he was renting. People got behind on the rent, or maybe they didn't even get behind, and he would not go collect the rent, so he got fired. So then he went to work at the United States Customs House. You know what a United States Customs House is?
Customs is not like,
Things that come in from overseas, you have to make sure they're okay, you bond them and do that. So he was hired at a United States Customs House.
But back then, they didn't like call his previous employers.
No, matter of fact, he was hired and he got fired from this job too. So he's having a hell of a time keeping a job.
that job too?
What? Yep, got fired from that one too. So
What happened?
he got hired, I'm not sure, he got hired at a United States Customs House, got fired, and then he went back and worked at his father's leather goods store. Remember, what was his business? He was a tanner. So he got a $50 a month job at his father's tannery business, leather store, okay? So he's just kind of lost, isn't he? So what's a perfect thing that's going to come up at 1861? That's right. And when Lincoln asked for those 75,000 volunteers, Grant jumped all over it. He had nothing going. He didn't really like what he was doing. And so in 1861, when Lincoln asked for those 75,000 volunteers, Grant volunteered, one of the first to volunteer. Okay? Now, we don't have to go through his Civil War career, because you know what happened there. And because of his celebrity and fame that he earned in the Civil War, he was elected president, right, in 1868. So we can kind of go from here to there. So the Civil War was a turning point in his life. When Lincoln asked for the volunteers in 1861, he volunteered. He had a great Civil War career, despite the fact he was kind of a, I don't know, not very successful after he quit the military the first time. Well, he actually was re-elected president in 1872. And despite the fact he did little or nothing and was involved in scandals, he had 286 electoral votes to his opponent's 66. Even though he didn't get anything done, he was that popular. So he won the election of 1872 as well, re-election. He swept that election. He had 286 electoral votes to his opponent's 66, and again was elected president of the United States. Served 2 terms, 2 of the worst terms we've ever seen, but he served them. And he did it because he was popular.
Who did he run against when he won the second time?
Who did he beat?
Yeah.
We'll cover that. Yeah, it wasn't Henry Clay.
Henry.
Now, here's the thing. In those days, you could get elected as many terms as you wanted. He wanted to serve a third. But because of the things that happened, the corruptions and things that happened, by 8 years, people got kind of tired of that, and so he lost his party's nomination in 1876. He actually would have been very happy to serve a third term, but didn't get the nomination. So he's elected in 1868, he's elected in 1872, and he ran in 1876, but did not get the nomination of his party. Well, unfortunately for Grant, when he left office, he was dying of cancer. And what do most presidents do as soon as they leave office? They still do this to today. What? No, well, they can, but what do they do?
Get depressed.
No, well, they might, but what, they don't disappear. There's something they do specifically, and I'm just trying to find, what do presidents do when
They write
they write what?
books,
That's what they call
They're, whatever they're called.
memory.
memoirs.
Memoirs.
Okay? They're called their memoirs. I must have them in my office. Anyway, I had a copy of Harry Truman's. But what presidents do is when they leave office, they write their memoirs. And what do they do with those memoirs?
Sell them.
They sell them for money. Now, in today's market, presidents make a hell of a lot more money speaking as former presidents than they ever made as president. Bill Clinton will command $100,000 an hour to talk to people. No, absolutely. So, those days that wasn't quite the thing, so they sold their memoirs. Guess how much Grant made on his memoirs? Guess who published them, first of all? He wrote them. Mark Twain published them. Mark Twain published them, and he made approximately $500,000. And that day was like 25 million now, maybe. I don't know. But he made a lot of money. So he got out of the presidency, left office, he wrote his memoirs. He was dying of cancer at the time, and I think a lot because his memoirs were published by Mark Twain, they sold for approximately $500,000, in total. Okay? In 1885, he moved to New York and died suddenly after moving there on July 23rd, 1885. So in 1885, he moved to New York, where he died suddenly on July 23rd, 1885. And they buried him in New York City. Yes?
Was cancer as rampant as it was back then, as it is now?
I don't think so. I think it wasn't as bad. Now, what about his wife? She actually never remarried. She passed away in 1902 and is buried by his side in New York City. And I want to leave you with a couple of things, because we're not going to lecture on his presidency and all. We're going straight to Native Americans after this, and then after we're done with Native Americans, we're going to go to the election of 1876. But historians will tell you, despite the fact that he might have been one of the most popular presidents we ever had, he probably goes down in history as the worst president we've ever had. His administration was filled with corruption, and his cabinet was considered the worst cabinet in American history. So as popular as he was as president, he goes down in history as probably the worst commander-in-chief we've ever had in the history of our country. but he did serve 2 terms and was very popular, yeah.
This is kinda off topic, but who was the first president to get like a colored picture?
I think probably if you go back, you might see some in this era here, but it might be in this era here. If you look them up, they're, you know, that's why they're black and white, is because I took the presidential portraits. These are the official presidential portraits, in the black and whites, and then they turned to color. And I could find a black and white one for you, but I mean, they started to use color about 1960.
When did they get pictures?
Pictures?
I bet that guy right there.
I'm not sure, you'd have to look up professional
Looks
photography.
like it's right
All right, here's the story. We are gonna have a review tomorrow, and we are gonna have a test in which we'll meet out in the Commons on Wednesday, okay? And then we're moving into Native Americans in the United States.
We make those little things that we made in elementary